Okay. I know that you're learning. I was told that you're learning about bishul, particularly about bishul, about coffee and tea. So we're gonna. Hopefully, I'm gonna satisfy your needs. So far, I've got to know many people from the kollel because every time I walk down the street, someone else says to me, "I'm learning in the kollel," and I hope you're going to say good answers because we don't know what's going on. So I keep meeting all the new members of the kollel. So hopefully, everyone's going to be satisfied when we're finished. Okay, I'm just going to, before I start, I'm going to introduce by telling you 6 things we're not going to talk about. Okay, that is, I see 6 questions that relate to making coffee and tea that are not really the Indian that we want to talk about. I'm sure you cast all of these shadows. I'm not saying something new. Just we're focusing on the bishul part of it. We're not talking about. There's a question of tzviya ba'othim, when you put tea and coffee in and you make it comes a new color. There's a question. There's 2 related questions of butter to pull the tea bag out, or if somebody afterwards goes and squeezes it or lets it drip out. Those are different kinds of questions. There's a question of moilid. Because when a person dissolves a solid into a liquid, there's a shaila of moilid for such a thing. These are all relatively minor compared to the real shaila. These are all things we're not going to talk about. Okay, there's a shaila. The Acharon talk about whether you can make tea in the kli shlishi. I'm sure you've heard about that. We're not going to talk about how you should get hot water. You're making tea. That means that you're starting off with hot water. We're not talking about that. And last is there are people. There's an extra shaila related to the prayer of a person actually squeezing it out. There are people who, when they get the tea out of the cup, they squeeze the bag out. Okay, all of those things. That's what we're not talking about. Okay, so what are we talking about? Okay, we're here to talk about the shaila that you want to know about, which is making regular coffee and tea. Okay, I brought some toys with me. Just help. Explain what we have. Okay, I have for you. You guys, if you want to look at these pictures, okay. This is. I didn't take these pictures, but this is a picture of coffee beans being roasted. Okay, they're in order. Okay, numbered 1 to 16. And what you see right away is that for people in the coffee business, when you have raw coffee beans, they're called green beans. Okay, if you go to someone who makes coffee and you talk to them about green beans and you think you need the long stringy things, okay, you're ready to show them that you're an Amoritz, okay? Green beans are the beans when they come out of, I don't know if they come out of the ground like that, but when they're ready to be processed, they're called green beans because they're green, okay? Because that's what the beans look like. The coffee beans, you've seen whole coffee beans, but they come out green. Okay? And then as you roast them, they sit in a big furnace with a big fire inside of them. And as they roast, the color... Dry roasted, yeah, with no heat, nothing else in it, no, just the bean by itself. The bean goes through this roaster. It tumbles around and around with a huge flame, like right out of Gehenna, right in the middle of it. Okay, and it's a big flame in the middle of it, and it gets roasted. It tumbles around, so it gets nice and roasted really well. And what happens is it moves through these different stages. It goes from darker and darker. You see the colors are getting darker. Okay, and there's basically 4 levels of how much you could roast a coffee bean that's considered good for drinking. Okay, I wanted to bring from downstairs the can. There's only 1 can of coffee downstairs. So when you go home, you'll see it on your own if you have a coffee can at home. Okay, right. Okay, so now you'll hear what they are. Okay, the thing that's marked number 10. Okay, that's the lowest level of roasting that's considered appropriate. They call it city roast. Okay, that's the official name. It's called city roast. When you get up to that, it happens after 10 minutes of roasting. When you get to number 12, that's called full city roast. Okay, it's a little more roasted. And what's going on while this is happening is that at the very beginning, the number 10 is what's called the first crack. Okay, which is the liquid that's inside the bean is escaping, and I think CO2 is escaping, and it's making changes in the bean. The bean is not tasting like it used to taste beforehand. The bean, it develops the taste that's in the bean. You're cooking something. You're making it taste very different than it used to. Okay, so the first point that it hits, that it's edible, meaning that it tastes like people expect coffee to taste like, is when you hit what the picture here is picture number 10, that's called city roast. And then you get to number 12, that's made another 30 seconds more, another minute more, that's called full city roast. You can go to number 13, it's called French roast or Vienna roast. Okay, another darga, and then 14 is the most that you could roast it. It's called full. Let me see if I got this right. That's called full French roast. Okay, if I understand it correctly, Starbucks coffee is in the area of number 12 and 13. That's the way that's how they cook. Okay, so that is to say, to most people, coffee is coffee. It keeps me awake. Then it's coffee. It doesn't. But to the Mumchim, the amount of roasting is very important. And if you look on the can, you'll see now. For the Hamoinam, they call that, mild, medium, strong, or dark. They have names like that. But if you look more carefully, and if you're more of a maven, you'll see other names like this thing, like French roast. French roast doesn't mean it came from France. That just is a style. The French roast is a style of roasting. And if you go even more, 15 and 16, that's going to burnt. Okay? That's not that you missed it. As you could see, it's beyond usable. That's not really what happened. And also, as you move further, like to the 13, 14, you stop tasting as much of the coffee as you're tasting the burning, basically you're burning the bean, and it has a different kind of a taste. Okay. So what do we hear from this whole spiel that I just said to you? Is that when you go to a store and you buy coffee, we didn't get up to putting it into your cup yet. When you buy coffee beans, go into the store and buy even ground coffee that you're going to have to brew. We could talk about brewing in a second. That coffee has been roasted. It's had a fiat to it, what we would call a fiat, add to it, in a way to make it from being less edible to being more edible. The thing is fully edible. Now, we could declare if a person were to take the bean, let's say he took a bean that was only city roasted, okay, and he stuck it back into the fire, back into the roaster. Let's say, I don't know if it's true, let's say he could continue the process. I'm not sure if once it stopped you can keep on going, but naniach you could. So then there would be a shayla. It would be an isser official to take it from being edible to being even more edible. Because if I took it from being, there's a deal in that.
And don't just mean it's stomach.
No, you're making it, in other words, some people like 13 and some people like 12. But well, that's a question. That we have to done is it's mevusha kotzarcha, meaning for me, I consider not this level city roast. That's good for me. But the next person who cooks it makes it into. So we went down on that, and maybe we'd say no, it's really completely cooked. It's not like going from number 4 to number 10. Number 4 is not edible at all. So maybe we went down on that. But that shaila is not really a shaila that's negated to us. Okay, nobody's taking coffee beans and roasting them in their house. And it's Kosher, that what you're going to do with water, no matter what you do in your house, you're not going to continue this process. You're not continuing the afiyah with what you're doing. We're going to talk about if you're doing bishul, but you're not doing afiyah. Even naniach it could work. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not sticking to my oven. I'm not trying to do anything like that. I'm doing a whole different process. I mean, when Chazal talk about this bishul and afiyah, it comes out over here. The afiyah has its effect on the beans, which is very different than what the bishul does to the beans. We see the bishul doing a whole different way. Okay. So the
first off, they say that further is a fiyah.
Oh yeah. If you're getting it,
not sleep.
What is sli and afiyah? Okay, sli and afiyah is the same thing. Yeah, for the dinner, I'm not sure. Right, it's considered the same. There's just two groups. There's bishul and tigun. That's one group, and then there's afiyah and sli. That's the other group. And ground. The what?
By ground. Everything.
All coffee.
All coffee.
It's true. Every coffee has to go through this process. Every coffee has to go through it. Everything. Instant we'll see, is even further. But every coffee goes through this. When it comes out of the ground, when it's what they call green beans, it's worthless. You can't do anything with it. It has no meaning to it.
When do they freeze dry a coffee?
We're not up to that yet. That's coming. That's way down the road. One process that happens before this, we're not really going to talk about it, which is decaffeination. They decaffeinate the beans before this. Before the roasting is when they get decaffeinated. So you roast it before you stick it into the you decaffeinate it before you roast it, which has Pesach nafkaminas. Okay, we're not talking about Pesach. I'm going to talk about it for a second. I'm going to pass it a little later, but I'm going to pass it in a second. But it's not really. But it's a question. But what the question that should strike you, I'll leave you just with the question. If you call the CRC, they're going to tell you shouldn't eat decaffeinated coffee for Pesach, unless it has hashgacha, because the process of decaffeination can make it chametzy. Okay, so my question, I'll leave you. The question is, well, if making it decaffeinated is a problem for Pesach, if you believe us, that's a problem, and they decaffeinate it before they put it in the roaster. So why isn't the regular coffee also good for Pesach? They both go into the same kelim. First you decaffeinate coffee today, and I told you that's a problem for Pesach, and then tomorrow you're going to roast regular beans in the same roaster.
decaffeination is the chametz.
Right, so they decaffeinate it. And then they take that, those beans that I just told you, you should eat
So we're decaffeinating.
and then they stick it into the roaster. They put it into the roaster. Right. If I'm telling you that you should eat those beans at Pesach because they might be chametz, they went into the roaster. Tomorrow they're putting in regular beans. How can you put regular? I'll leave you the question. Okay? A different day. Okay. Let's just think about the question. Okay.
You could have it, Pesach.
What? You got regular beans. Yeah. You got regular beans. Don't worry about that. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So now that's the first step in eating, in having coffee. The first step is roasting. Okay. And the poskim will talk about it. They talk about that the beans had afiyah to them. Okay. The next step you need to do to coffee is you need to brew it. Okay. That is to say, is you want to take this coffee bean and turn it into a liquid. You want to be able to extract the flavor that's in that bean and make it that someone could drink, make a beverage out of it. That's called brewing. And if you see in a more sophisticated coffee machine, not an instant coffee, what you do is you grind up this bean, you make it into what they call ground coffee. You take up these grinds, and then you pour hot water through it. But you don't just pour hot water through it. You pour hot water through it very slowly. And the kavanah is, when it goes through slowly, it has time to extract the flavor out of these beans. Okay, and you grinding it up also, so the water has a lot of contact with all the surfaces. Excuse me? And it slowly sucks out as much flavor as it can out of the beans, and gives you all that flavor out of the beans, and then the beans are garbage. Okay? A variation that takes a few minutes. A variation is something called espresso. Okay? Espresso is a concentrated extract that comes out of coffee, and it's made much quicker. It's done with pressure, and it takes maybe 30 seconds to get all the flavor out. So it uses the same bean, and it gets all the flavor out, but instead of it making a whole cup of coffee, it makes just a little schnapps glass of coffee.
K-cups also?
The K-cup is really just a brewing of coffee. It's just, but instead of brewing a whole pot of coffee, you brew just one spoonful. Right, the same thing. It's the K-cup is roasted coffee, which has not yet been brewed yet. It's roasted coffee, but instead of making a whole pot of it, you're making just one little cup, and it has a tiny little filter. The bottom of the K-cup is a tiny little filter. So usually you drip the water through, and it goes through the beans, through the grinds, and then through the filter, and this has a tiny little filter, so you're making one individual cup. That's what you do. Okay. So if a person brews coffee in their house, if I make a pot of coffee in my office, if I were to do that on Shabbos, what is that an example of? That's an example of Bishlach Harafiyah. It had afiyah to it. I am now slowly putting the hot water through it to get the flavor out of it. That's considered Bishlach Harafiyah. So for Ashkenazim, we can't do that. The Ramah says that we're machmir to not do Bishlach Harafiyah. So if I want to brew coffee on Shabbos, I couldn't do that. Brewing coffee on Shabbos would be Bishlach Harafiyah. I say it for Ashkenazim because there's a question which way the Mechaber passes about that shaila. Rabbi Vard Yosef learns that the Mechaber is makel about that shaila, and he says specifically for coffee, he says so Sfardim could do it. He says because it's Bishlach Harafiyah. So he holds that the Mechaber holds that Bishlach Harafiyah is mutter. The Mechaber brings 2 days, but he holds that the Mechaber really is makel about it. So he says, so Mamela, if you're a Sfardi, he says you can make. He wants to say maybe for Ashkenazim, but we'll leave that. But he says, but for a Sfardi who doesn't have to be maful for Bishlach Harafiyah, so we're in business. He says it had afiyah, it's fully edible. The liquid that I'm pouring through, that's what I said to you before. The water that I pour through is not adding to the afiyah. It's not like it's going to continue on that we can talk about that. Of course not. It's doing the bishul process, and bishul afiyah for Sfardim is beseder. So Rabbi says that they could do that. Okay, but we can't do that. We're Ashkenazim, I think you're right. Ashkenazim, we can't do that. We're not going to do bishul afiyah. Okay, now I'm going to leave you. I'm going to mention something that later hopefully we'll have time to talk about it. Ramesh declares that maybe you should be allowed to brew coffee on Shabbos. Ramesh has declared in a cliche, he says maybe you could do it. It has to do with Ramesh, how he defines what it means tavlin. Tavlin is a thing that you're allowed to put into a cliche. Ramesh has a sheet about how he defines tavlin. If we have time, when we get to the tea part, we'll talk about it, and we'll come back to this. Why Ramesh says not to do it. Ramesh says only do it in a cliche. But he says, in Misvara, he thinks you could do it in a cliche. Okay.
Moshe talking about when you want to use the coffee as a spice, or even
No, to make a coffee. He wants to talk about making a cup of coffee. He's talking for real, like
okay.
Like everybody else does. Okay. Now,
No, it's using it like a tea bag. They have to use a tea bag.
Yes. Now, we're all familiar. We're used to the way the Mishnah Berurah paskins, which is that, okay, before we get to Mishnah Berurah, we know that there are some things, most things need to be cooked in a Kli Rishon. There are things that could be cooked even in a Kli Sheni. The Torah has certain examples of things that can cook in a Kli Sheni, and certain things that cannot cook in a Kli Sheni. Okay? So we're used to the way the Mishnah Berurah says, which is we're machmir that basically just about everything can cook in a Kli Sheni. Okay? That's not the din. We don't know which things fall into that category, so we're machmir that basically just about everything cooks in a Kli Sheni, except the specific exceptions that says in the Gemara or in the Poskim that will make them. But Rabbi Roberts was telling me yesterday that you've seen the Chazon Ish says that min hadiv mikra, then he holds that no, really Kli Sheni is not mavashel. He holds that really a Kli Sheni is not mavashel. So at first glance you would look at that and you would say, well, if a Kli Sheni is not mavashel except for specific things, so then according to the Chazon Ish, I can also make it in the Kli Sheni. I can make my coffee in the Kli Sheni. It had nothing to do with the afiyah of it, because what's the problem is special and what's a Kli Sheni? I'm allowed to basically almost whatever I want to in a Kli Sheni. Okay? But right there in the Chazon Ish, he says two exceptions to that rule. He says, even though I hold that you could do bishul in a Kli Sheni for most foods, he basically argues on the Mishnah Berurah, even though you could do bishul for most things, he says two exceptions when you're not allowed to do it. One exception is if the food was already baked. If this food was already made edible through some other form, meaning through afiyah, then the bishul happens very quickly. Then bishul, even though usually bishul can't happen in a Kli Sheni, but if you already had afiyah, then bishul could happen in a Kli Sheni, which is our case. That's what our case is. It already had afiyah done to it.
That's a field pot. Field pot. It's clear. What's the roast in the beef?
What's the difference? He's saying is once it was made edible, in other words, you have to get over a certain hump to make it edible. Once it's edible, so now switching from afiyah to bishul. That little switch over, that's easy to do. Even a Kli Sheni could do that.
Even though normally we have bishul after afiyah, it's more of it.
Right, so it's a funny thing the Chazon Ish is saying. He's saying usually, right, it's a cool. We say, man, ain't bishul after afiyah. But here he's saying is, but if you're just, once we've decided that we're machmir for bishul after afiyah, but so once we have it already cooked, just to switch it over from this to this, like that's easy. To switch over from one to the other. The Chazon Ish, it's right in, it's in the Chazon Ish.
He says,
of course, it's true.
We did not learn that way. We learned it in the past. He learned that.
I understood it to mean is that it's not nothing unique about pas. It's that. Think about it. If I take a loaf of bread and I stick it into the oven, I take a piece of dough and put it into the oven. It takes an hour for it to cook. I say half an hour. How long it take? It takes a whole time to cook.
But once it's cooked, that's what rachaf means.
Yes.
Say the word rachaf.
Rachaf is no, it's not focusing on the food. He's saying I went through so much effort to get it already edible. I already threw in the afiyah part. I went through so much effort. So then, just to get to the bishul level of cooking is also okay. That's you don't see that. Okay. The other thing he says is the other thing, which is also another thing, is he says that if I'm only making about a Kli Sheni if it's a regular Kli Sheni. He says, but if it's yad nichnas boy, then I'm not making. Okay. So now, I don't see Poskim telling us what yad nichnas boy is, but if it'll help you for the dugma, okay, the word yad nichnas boy means that a person's hand can get burnt to death. Okay, so it turns out that to burn someone with a piece of skin is the worst kind of burn, is we call third-degree burn. And to burn it is not just a matter of temperature; it's a measure of time and temperature. Okay, that means I'm looking at my numbers over here. Okay, you can get if a person had water that was only 120 degrees, which is not very hot, but he kept his hands in there for 10 minutes, he would get a third-degree burn also. Okay, so it's not only a measure of temperature; it's a measure of time and temperature. But at 160 degrees, okay, in a half a second, the person will get a third-degree burn. Okay, if you go down to 150, this is like very scientific. 156, it takes a whole second. There's a whole charts here of how you do this. What I'm saying is, at 160 degrees, you could get a burn in a half a second. So I don't know if that's yad nechos. It's still a certain amount of time. It's not an automatic. And I don't know really what the shear is. But most people make their coffee not at 160 degrees. When you pour water into a coffee, you're doing with water 180 degrees, 200 degrees, using water that's close to boiling. So l'chayra, it'll qualify as yad nichos. I don't know what the shear is.
You know how hot the water is
so I don't know. Those are on the lower end, but the 160, 170. Which measure I should have measured it. I have to remember to measure that. But those are, and the pump pots are even hotter. I'm saying they're very hot, close to boiling. So the person has to. So the Chazon Ish's second exception is that if it's yad nichvus boy, then he's machmir for Kli Sheni. It's a chayodim. I'm sure you saw the chayodim. Chayodim is machmir Not everybody's masking to that, but here we're trying to go. You want to say, according to the Chazon Ish, I should have to make my coffee. The Chazon Ish right there, or maybe in the next paragraph, says that if it's Yad Nechlis point, then you have to be machmir and say that the Klisheni is mavash.
Even some says that even the Achnivas is never some Mekel.
Right, but
no goes so not going to.
is that what he says? Really, we're making for it? Is that what he
He
says?
says because Klisheni across the world, you'll find any Nechlis in Shas.
Okay.
No, it says that therefore.
I don't remember. Could be. Okay.
It says that feed you, that you eat the whole, but you can also. But I don't hold away, but no, you can.
Okay, so I don't remember. I'm not arguing. I don't remember that part. But anyhow, so if you want to say I should be able to brew my coffee because of the Chazon Ish, that the Chazon Ish said that the Chazon Ish said we don't have to mach on the klisheni, so I could find a way to brew my coffee in the klisheni. I mean, that's not usually how you do it, but I could work around it and do it in the klisheni. The Chazon Ish himself gave two reasons. Both of his exceptions seemingly applied to over here. Okay, one exception was if it had a fear. One is where I understood it. The other exception was if it was Nechlis point, which
at least he said to be
listen, it could be. If you want to get around the second one, you could. You can wait for my water to cool down a little bit, and then I'll do it. But you're not going to get such a great cup of coffee. The hot water is helping get out the time also. So, okay, if you're so desperate, okay, fine. So we did so far. The two steps we did so far to make coffee are. You always have to do this for coffee. You have to roast it, and then you have to brew it. Those are the two steps we did so far. Okay? So, and that's for when I talked about brewing. I'm talking about brewing. If you do the brewing in your house, you go buy the whole beans or the ground beans, and you brew it in your house. But lots of people are too lazy to do that, so they buy instant coffee. Okay? Instant coffee is another darga step. Instant coffee means that they roasted it, because you have to do that, and they brewed it also. The company brewed it in a big pot. I mean, it's not a big pot, but the same idea. They brewed it also. And then what they did is they said, now that I've gone through that pachka of brewing the coffee, now I'm going to get the water out of it and turn it into a powder that you're going to take home and you'll be able to just put it into water. It'll turn into coffee. I brewed it already. I got all the time out of the beans, and then you're going to take it home and you're going to use that to make something very easily. Just like when you put sugar into a drink, you don't sit there and heat it up to get it to dissolve. Well, you just put it in, and it's in. So this also, you're going to put it in, it's going to make it silly.
That step was bishul.
So right, it's not the last step. First it was afia, then there was bishul, now there's another step to turn it back into a powder. Right now you have a big pot of coffee. I'm going to explain it. I'm going to leave you hanging. Okay, so there are two ways to do it. The two ways are not going to get to Shabbos, they're going to be to get to Pesach, so I'll tell you what they are. Okay, the two ways are, you've heard these terms probably, freeze drying, you may have heard that, especially in your coffee, and another way called spray drying. Okay, that you maybe did or didn't hear that term. Okay. What does that mean? Freeze drying is, they lay out the coffee on trays. They don't just do it for coffee, they do it for lots of foods. They put the food onto a tray, and it's frozen solid. They put it into the freezer, and it freezes solid all the way through. And then, so right now the liquid is in a solid form. Okay? Usually when something's in a solid form and you warm it up, it turns into a liquid. It goes from a solid to a liquid, and if you heat it up even more, it turns into a gas. Right? It turns into vapors. What they do is they put it into a special machine called a freeze dryer. Okay? How it works is not so important right now. It sits there for 24 hours under very frozen solid.
It's all the water and
the made coffee, the brewed coffee,
which is water and
ice. It's ice, right? It's now ice. They put the whole ice into there, and under very, very controlled conditions. It's a vacuum with a very specific temperature. It's a very, very sophisticated. It takes 24 hours to erech. The water goes from being solid and from ice to being a vapor, but it never turns into a liquid. It passes from solid to vapor without ever being a liquid, which seems like impossible. Right? How could it be? It doesn't work. If you took an ice cube and you put it into a pot, it would be an ice cube, and then it would be water, and then it would turn into vapor. And then this is the magic of freeze drying, that it turns right into a vapor. And the point of it is that when you do that, it helps the food that you did that to retain a lot of its character. If any of you ever had an instant soup, there are vegetables on top of it, the peas or corn. They look very real. They look very natural. That's because they were freeze dried. It retains its shape. Sometimes you have cereal that has fruit inside of it. That fruit was freeze dried. It retains a lot of its character and its flavor.
He said tablet.
What? Wait.
Okay. Whoa. Okay. So that is. So really, I think it's nothing. Really, no. It's nothing because it's not. It's hard to say that it's an afia because even though it's dry and there's heat, the heat is very low and it's doing nothing. We'll see more about this later.
It's freezing. It's freezing.
It goes in frozen,
right.
And then heat is applied in a very controlled way that makes it go from being frozen to being vapors, to get the water out as vapors without ever being a liquid in the middle.
So freeze dry is not only it doesn't go vapor through freezing. It goes through.
No, it starts frozen, and then it goes from that frozen state into being a powder without ever having the liquid. The liquid's never there. There's no mush in the thing. It goes from solid to powder. When you pull it out, it's powder.
It's really the second in turning to liquid or vapor.
It's
second in turning to vapor into water or vapor.
No, that's how we would think is what happened. But there's this deep chachma to this. I don't know what it is. The guy once tried it. They wanted to explain it to me. I don't have any idea. It's not my basic. And actually, it's negate how it works in you, whether you have to kasha these candles. There's shilas that have to do with that. But for our purposes, it goes into chayra. It seems to be that there's no afiyah going on. The food comes out cold, out of the thing. It doesn't come out hot even, out of the freeze dryer. And ever hot? They claim it's not. It's hard to understand it. It's at for 24 hours at 160 degrees. It's hard to believe, but it doesn't. It comes out not hot. And it comes out cold and it's dry. And the chachma here is, again, all this effort is going in to make it retain its character. So they want the corn that you see in your cup of soup to look exactly and taste exactly like a piece of corn. So all the effort is to Badafka not change it. They want it to stay perfectly the way it is. L'chara is not even enough here. That's l'chara, it's not enough here. That's the fancy way to make coffee. That's the more sophisticated and the more expensive, and the thing that comes out tastes better. And there's another thing that it hydrates better. When you put it into water, it right away turns back into coffee. It doesn't clump up.
You will still call this mebush.
Right. It had afia, it had bishul, and then had nothing. Okay, and it was frozen. Well, not nothing, but it was frozen. But there's nothing. Nothing happened to it. That's what we say. Now, the other process, the other way to do it is called spray drying. Okay. just told you something that's very fancy and sophisticated, and spray drying is punt paquet. What they do is they take they made the coffee, they roasted it, and they brewed it, and now they have this big pot of coffee, and what they do is they spray the coffee in a very fine mist into a huge chamber, okay? From high up, maybe 50 feet high, into this big 50-foot chamber, and they spray it as a very fine mist. In that chamber, the chamber is very hot. It's a few hundred degrees in there. So what happens is, as these little drops of liquid are falling from 50 feet all the way down to the bottom, they're in a very fine mist. All the water that's in there boils out. And the water, as it's falling, the drop, as it's falling, is boiling out before it hits the floor. Okay, and you do it in a very fine mist because you want it to boil. If you pour it down with a hose, it wouldn't work. So they do it in a very fine mist, and by the time it hits the bottom, it's a powder. Okay, and this, in contrast to the freeze drying, this is very cheap, and we couldn't do this at home, but this is very cheap for them to do it. It's very fast, but it also makes a product that's not as good. In the finished product, it's been worked through again, it doesn't come out as good, and the other thing doesn't hydrate as well. So if you pick up a cup of coffee, I brought a sample here. If you look at it in 1 second, I only have one type. The yeshiva's coffee downstairs is freeze dried, and you can see. I brought you guys some shit. If you look at the pieces, you'll see that if you look at the pieces of the freeze dried coffee, you'll see that they're chunks. Okay, the things come out of the freeze dryer as chunks, as opposed to the spray dried coffee comes out as a powder. Now, in some people they clump the powder back together into be a little more chunky. They're doing that because it helps to dissolve it. Not only for looks, but it dissolves it. It used to be the really, really cheap coffee is mamash a powder. But the other ones it's called the agglomerate. They make the agglomerate. They come with yes.
These could dissolve in cold water also.
Probably. We didn't try it, but probably. But the other one, if you had the other one in your hand, if you had the spray dried one in your hand, it crumbles. It turns right back into a powder easily. This is a little bit crumbled, but this is like a little pebble. It looks like. If you put it between your fingers, it immediately turns back into a powder. Okay, you can tell the difference. Why do you want to know the difference? Is because this is negate the Pesach, and that is as follows: when you make freeze-dried coffee, all that goes into the freezer and into the freeze dryer is just coffee. You make your coffee, you put it into the freezer, you brew it coffee, you put it into the freezer, and it comes out. That's it that's in there.
Water too.
Well, there's water in the brewing, but it's water and coffee, and assuming that it's not decaffeinated, and assuming it's not flavored, it's okay to taste. But if you do freeze drying, some companies who spray drying. Some people who do spray drying add starch into the liquid before they spray it. And the reason why they're doing that, some of it is because they want it's cheaper, it's very sharp, but also it's because they want something for it to hold on to. When it turns into a powder, when it boils out as it's falling down, they want it to have something to hold on to, so they put starch into it. So those spray dried coffees could have hummus or kidneys mixed into them. Part of it could be in there, and la dafka would be on the ingredient panel. It's called a processing gate. It wouldn't be there. So the spray dried coffee needs to have hashgacha b'Pesach, and the freeze dried does not. So if you'll see when it comes closer to Pesach, they'll tell you these couple of brands are okay for Pesach, even without hashgacha of the regular coffee, not decaffeinated and not flavored. What's special about those brands is that they're freeze dried. So if you go to your house and you have a freeze-dried coffee and it's not decaffeinated, you can figure it out for yourself that it's okay. I don't know brand name offhand.
Well, this Nescafe, they have a special bottle that says Kosher will taste like and it costs more. It's way to make more money.
Special bottle.
No, there's nothing different about
It's way
it.
to make more money.
I don't know.
But it's special.
You should. Wait.
That's freeze dried.
Right.
Yeah,
If you don't know,
they're all freeze dried.
So I have to tell you something.
Nescafe is.
I don't know if it is. I don't know if it always is. You have to. Okay. So now I have to tell you something. You just letting you what he said. You should get a new can Memonisha, okay? Because you shouldn't be sticking the same spoon in with your coffee, and then. But the new can could come from Sam's Club just like this one did. I mean, it didn't have to be a special difference.
The Pesach and not has to do with the aroma. If you buy the Hamish brand, the Nescafe Hamish brand, you see the aroma of the coffee is not the same.
Okay.
I'm not going
There's a story behind it. There's a story behind it also. Okay, good. Okay, so back to the Shabbos. Both of these coffees, both the freeze-dried and the spray-dried, both had a fia, and then they had bishul to them. Okay, so both of them, now that they had bishul to them, there's no problem I can't put it into klivishin, but I can put it into klisheni. It already had bishul to it. So whereas I can't brew my own coffee, because when I brew my coffee, I'm doing bishul achar a fia. Here it had a fia and bishul, and I could do that. I can now go ahead and do another bishul to the creation. So there's a question that the Biur Halacha talks about. Maybe if you did bishul, afia, and bishul, and then another afia, maybe that undoes the bishul that happened before. So in that question, is what to think about whether the spray dried coffee has done that. I mean, it definitely had afia and bishul, but was there another afia afterwards? I have two answers to that. One is that I would assume that that last step is not an afia. Okay, what's happening? I'm boiling out the water. No, I'm spray drying. On the spray drying. On the spray drying, what I'm doing is I'm boiling out the water, and then the powder is now falling another, the rest of the feet down to the bottom. Is that an afia? You know what I mean? I'm going to tell you about it when we get to the tea. Ramesh talks about that afia has to do something to it. Yeah, but it has to do something. So it's sat there for another 10 seconds, flying through the oven as a powder. Did it make an effect on it that undid the bishul? In order to, what the Biur Halacha is talking about is the last afia undid the bishul. Did that happen?
Yeah, it took out the liquid.
No, that's bishul. We boiled out the liquid, and now we have this powder. So the first 30 feet was boiling out the liquid.
Didn't boil.
The powder. What happened to the powder? Did the powder get changed?
The acres of the top, nothing happened, but it changed the texture. I mean, now
What did it change? No. The liquid. Wait. The liquid is when it's cooking as a liquid. That's bishul. The question is, after it lost all the liquid boiled out of it, now there's a little powder left, and it falls the last bunch of feet till it hits the floor. So in those last 10 seconds, is that enough fear?
But that's not water. Therefore, now it's getting hot.
What would you call it? You call that bishul or afia?
But what happened to the cornstarch? It was water.
Hold on a second.
It was water.
What?
As it was coming down in the fish, you had a piece.
So at the beginning, there was liquid. When you had the liquid, was that a bishul or afia? What would you do with that?
That must have been bishul.
That was bishul because that liquid. So now, at that point, you don't care because bishul is good for us. What happens? Halfway down, let's say the water was all boiled out. So the last halfway down, that was an afia. In those 30 seconds, it's hard to. And also, the other good news is you probably learned it when you learned the Biur Halacha. The Iglei Tal says that most Lachronim hold not like the Biur Halacha. I mean, it doesn't call it Biur Halacha. Most like the Biur Halacha himself brings that the Pri Megadim is makel about it. That there's not such a concern. Okay, so that's another thing. Now, you want to know is, he says, wait a second, he told us that they stick starch into it. So they stick starch into it, so the coffee was mavushal, but what about the starch? Was that mavushal? Okay. So there's a shaila in Rav Moshe. I'm going to add one thing to what he said. There were people who talked about that a certain brand of instant coffee, that this company's chachma, why their instant coffee was so good, is that after they made that coffee, instant coffee, they stuck in a little unbrewed coffee. Okay? That was the rumor that they did it. After they made freeze-dried, spray-dried coffee, they then stuck in some raw, only roasted, not brewed coffee. Okay? It happens to be the Kosher. Okay, but the shaila was, what would be if it was true? So this Rav Moshe talks about whether should you follow Roy. Should you say if Roy of the food is mavushal, he has a different variation, but the same idea. Roy of the food is mavushal, and me is not mavushal. Rav Moshe assumes that is a shash. That's a problem. He brings, Poskim would say not like that. He's not so happy about it. But I would say, so he's not so happy. Rav Moshe in the end is not so thrilled to be makel about that. But I would say what happens is, when you spray dry something, okay, I told you spray it as a mist into the big chamber. Okay? But before you spray it in, they heat up that liquid again before it goes into the spray jar. I mean, even if it was cold, they heat it up again before it goes in. So we have what declared that they had a bishul there also. They put the starch into it, and then they heated it up again before it went in. Obiat sled this way. Under 60 or 8 degrees, they put it into the mixture before. Right, they put the powder in, heat up the whole thing, and then put it in. So we have what the...
So it's a fear bishul? Two set bishals?
Fear, bishul. Yeah, if that makes you feel, yeah, it doesn't hurt anybody if it has an official. We don't have a problem if we had another afia. It's just
it's not official with it. No,
Official's good.
Official's good. No, we had afia, bishul, afia. Then potential.
But it's here, afia, bishul, now we put it on my third bishul.
Right. Now we have afia.
What's more maker? We've got a more maker.
Yeah. Okay. One last kind of coffee. Okay, guys. One last kind of coffee.
But freeze-dried is for sure.
Right. There's no afia. I don't. It's hard to believe that you could call that afia. They're making such an effort to not make any change in the thing. There's not. Well, no. It just said bishul. It just said bishul. It had afia and then bishul.
What temperature is in there? 160.
In the freeze dryer.
Yeah.
They tell you that I've touched the product coming out of the freeze dryer. It was cold. And if they tell you that it doesn't get hot in there, my mind doesn't absorb it because it's sitting at 160 degrees for 24 hours. My mind doesn't see it.
160 there?
Yeah. Well, it's not exactly. It goes up and down. It's very. What? Maybe. It doesn't sit in my head that it's a
Vaporizing for salt.
In Mir Hashem, if you would talk to me, and I can come back next week. We'll do salt. Okay. We have other things if we ever get to there. Okay. Let's see. We'll talk about salt and some other foods like that. Salt has its own special thing. Really.
Right now, Scott.
Salt is much more interesting than coffee. Particularly because it's not so Miguel Lamaisa, you know? It's not as people are very passionate about their coffee. Okay. One more thing I'll mention before we go on to the last kind of coffee, which is, most of us assume that if you take water out of a pot and you put it into a cup, that water is now in a cliche. The pot is a cliche, you put it into the cup, it's a cliche. Okay? Okay, I'll tell them later. It's okay. So the Chazon Ish held, based on the Deacon and Rashi, that maybe if the pot that it came from was still on the fire when you took the water out of it, I mean, not that you took the pot off, but it was still on the fire, it might be considered that the cup that it fell into is also finished. Okay? So, I'm not really going to talk about it, except to tell you, there's a long footnote in Shmir Shabbos Kosher about this Chazon Ish, a long footnote about it, where he thinks that many people argue on it, maybe the Chazon Ish didn't mean it for these dinim, he has all kinds of things to say about that, and he's not so worried about it. And most of us assume like that. Most of us walk around assuming that the pot afterwards is a cliche, so we're pretty comfortable with that. Okay, let's go. Last kind of coffee. Okay. I told you so far, really 3 kinds of coffee. You could buy beans that are just roasted, and you brew them at home. And then I told you 2 other kinds of ways that you could buy already brewed coffee. Okay? There's a 4th kind of coffee. It's not so much what you buy in your house. You could. It's more for what you buy in a machine. I forgot to check downstairs if that's what the machine is. And that is, it's a liquid. It's a liquid coffee concentrate. And that is, they roast coffee beans, and then they get the tam out of the coffee beans with water, but they sell you the water. They don't take the water out. They sell you the water, the concentrated water.
Keurig has that.
No, it's not a Keurig. Keurig is just the coffee grind. It's just a little bit of coffee grind with a filter and you pour water through. But if you have, and they're sold what they call them. It's called BIB, bag in box. They would just say they put the liquid into a bag, it goes in a cardboard box, it sticks into the machine, and when you push the button, you're getting half of that concentrate, half hot water, and then your cup and bottom is now fully cooked coffee. So, like this. It depends how they did it. It depends how they did the extraction. If many people do it with hot water, like you would expect. They make this concentrate with hot water, in which case, no problem. That hot water is, like you said, all you said is like an essence. It's like a coffee essence. And the Seder, in the Klisheni, it would be mutter. So as long as your water's in the Klisheni, then you'll be okay. But there are other people who don't make it with hot water, they make it with cold water. Okay? Who say that they make even better coffee because they do that extraction with cold water. I don't understand the chachma. I don't know how it works. I mean, what's the technology? How do you get the time out with cold water? I don't know. But there's such a thing, they get out with cold water. So what's the din of that cold water? So there's a diag, or sometimes makes a diag in Mishabur. When Mishabur is talking about tea essence, he says, and if you make the tea essence before Shabbos, you could put that tea essence into a klisheni because the tea essence was ready mevushal before Shabbos. Shem Shlomo says, wait a second. Why did he say you're allowed to do it because the water was mevushal before Shabbos? So ain't bishul ha-bishul. Why did he say that? Why didn't he say you're allowed to do that because water is not kali ha-bishul? Water is one of the few things we know is not kali ha-bishul. So you're allowed to put it back in because it's just water.
He's not putting the using the bag itself.
I don't know that. I don't remember saying that. He says the essence you made. So you think you put the bag with it also? Okay. If that's tell it.
He said you make sure that the bag is. He doesn't say that you make sure that the bag is.
Okay, we can look at that. So he says, why did he take it? He could have just said, water is water. That's it. Water is not kali ha-bishul. Big deal. You put it into cliche, whatever you want. Shom Zam is like two things, a two-step thing from that. First is that when you have water that drew tam out of something else, that doesn't have the din of water. It's the din of shar mashkin. He says that's the first thing. Mr. Brewer is saying that thing is considered shar mashkin.
That sounds like kali ha-bishul.
What? Second is. Shulchan Aruch Rav said that shar mashkin is not kali ha-bishul. That he says just like water is also shar mashkin. Mr. Brewer is arguing on that and saying that shar mashkin is kali ha-bishul or is a suffix of kali ha-bishul. Only water is a kula, but not other shar mashkin. So the Shulchan Aruch Rav says he brings it. The Shulchan Aruch Rav says not like that. But the Mr. Brewer, why is he taking this case? Because he holds that it makes it shar mashkin. And if it's shar mashkin, there's a second thing which is, and it's a chumrah that shar mashkin are not considered kali ha-bishul. They're not the special din of water. It's other din. Okay, so it's in the Shmir Shabbos. Yeah, it's in Shmir Shabbos. It's in Ha'ara Tufdun Al. What? It's in the Shulchan Aruch and Sifigil? Okay, I don't know. I'll have to look at it. I'm sure from Zalman did that. I know. Okay, I have to just tell you, according to that, if you go like that, if this liquid coffee concentrate was made with cold water, then you wouldn't be allowed to use it on Shabbos in the Klisheni. It would be shar mashkin, and according to this, you wouldn't be allowed to do it. I'll just tell you, I don't know if we would take this, but Rav Chaim Kanievsky says that the reason, maybe this is Kosher, the reason why Mishabur picked that case is because he wanted to tell you that you could put the essence, even if the water is yad nichvus by. Yad nichvus by, you can't put in water into yad nichvus by, but you could put it if it's bishul ha-bishul, if it's ready as mavoshel, then you put it into yad nichvus by. So the reason why the Mishabur picked the case said it's mutter because it's aim b'shal ha-bishul, because he wanted to make it mutter even if it's yad nichvus by. Meaning, Reb Chaim is l'shikaseh of the Chazrish, it would be machmer for yad nichvus by. He wants to say you can let yad nichvus by, so he wants to. Mishabur wants you to be clear no matter what. Don't have any reason to be choishes, and not like this deal. Okay, but Rosh Hashanah says like this deal. According to Rosh Hashanah, if you wanted to know if you could use this coffee on Shabbos, you'd have to find out how they made it. Did they do it with cold water, or did they do it with hot water? You have to call me. Right? You have to call Mashkacha. Find out how did they do it. Some people do this, and some people do that. You have to look at it. Okay. I suspect we're out. Are we out of time? How long do you go for? You tell me. Because I'm finished with coffee. I go on to tea, or we can just stop here. We stop it? Fine. Okay.